Hello, welcome to today's seminar. I hope you all had a great summer break. And I thank you for being with us tonight on the first webinar of the fall round of the GC Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. A webinar series with the aim of discussing concepts that are currently not mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. Today we have a great speaker, Mike Lenox of Darden Business School. He's going to talk about the path to decarbonization. We also have a great moderator, Sarah Al-Battuti. I will introduce Sarah and I will give Sarah the floor and she will introduce the speaker and the topic. Sarah graduated from the University of Cambridge with a BA in Architecture, Environmental Masters. She has an MSc from Cambridge in Sustainable Development, focused on climate change and project management in remote hazardous region. She's the founder of an environmental design consultancy, eConsult, an entrepreneur, founder of a upcycled recycling furniture startup. Sarah served as a presidential advisor on climate change and sustainability, and is a multi-award winning architect who was recently selected as an awardee of the Vital Voices UN 6 Global Women Leaders, as well as Ashton List for Climate Solutions and Bloomberg Good Business. I have really sort of summarized some of her achievements. She's much more than that. She's on the board of many things, including the School of Architecture and the School of Business at the AUC. Without much ado, I'll pass to Sarah, who will introduce Mike. Sarah, floor is yours, my dear.
Hello, everyone. This is a great opportunity to get us all to meet Professor Michael. So let me just say how the webinar will proceed. I will introduce Professor Michael, and then we will proceed to a 30 to 35 minute presentation, followed by a Q&A and a sort of interactive discussion for about 20 minutes, and then a quick wrap up, onwards and upwards, sort of wrap up to the session. If you do like to ask questions, please do feel free to do that in the chat room, type them in, and we will try and go through as many as possible. Now, I don't want to delay you all. Let's start with Professor Michael's bio. Professor Michael Lenox is a Taylor Murphy Professor of Business at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business and serves as the school's Senior Associate Dean and Chief Strategy Office. He serves as the Associate Dean of Innovation Programs and Academic Technology Management and Policy, Innovation Programs and Academic Directors of Darden's Baton Institute of Entrepreneurship and Innovation. He received his PhD in Technology Management and Policy from MIT and a bachelor's degree and Masters of Science in Systems Engineering from the University of Virginia. His primary expertise is the domain of technology and policy, with a broad interest in the role of innovation and entrepreneurship for growth and firm competitive success. Through that, he explores the interface between business strategy and public policy as it relates to the natural environment. He recently has authored Can Business Save the Earth? Innovating Our Way to Sustainability, from Stanford University Press, and he has been cited in a number of media outlets such as the New York Times, Financial Times, and The Economist. He was recognized as a faculty pioneer by the Aspen Institute, as the top strategy professor under 40 by the Strategic Management Society, and one of the top 40 business professors under 40 by Poets and Quants. Now, that's quite a lot of content. I'm sure we would love to hear everything. And let's get to it straight away. The floor is yours, Professor Michael. We can't wait to hear all about this. Thank you.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Professor Ali, thank you and the Gerhard Center for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity to share some of my recent work with you all. I'm glad to hear we have a global audience with us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book that Sarah had mentioned, Can Business Save the Earth? And I'm also working on a follow-up book that is called The Path to Decarbonization, Transforming the Global Economy by 2050. But before I jump into that, I actually wanted to start with a kind of personal story, a personal anecdote, if you will, here. So when I was growing up in the 70s, I became enamored with whales. So I had a little stuffed whale in my on my bed. I had a whale poster in my home, and this was during a period where there was a global movement to save the whales, recognizing that some have value that whales bring, and there was an attempt to try to limit the global whaling industry. Now, I raise this question because as an economist, when we typically think about such a situation, we frame it in terms of negative externalities. We have a marketplace for whales. We have those who value whales who aren't priced into the market. That creates a negative externality, and it needs some intervention institutionally, policy and the like, to try to correct that situation. So let's go back a little further in time to the 1850s. You see here a picture from the New England whaling industry. New England whaling industry was a vibrant industry, hunting whales from around the world, primarily to use their blubber and their whale oil to create a lighting fluid in wide use in the US and around the world. This industry reached its peak in around 1850, 1855 or so, and then saw a quick, failure and a collapse of this industry. So why did this occur? Well, it wasn't because they simply fished out all the whales, though they were going further and further around the world to find whales. There was still an abundant supply. And it wasn't because there was some global rising against whaling, some advocacy movement to try to prevent whaling. In fact, what we simply had was a technology shift. Soon around this time, we had the discovery of oil in Western Pennsylvania. And the gentleman here on my right, Abraham Gesner, a Canadian, devised a way of turning that oil into kerosene, an alternative technology for creating light. And what we saw in a very short period of time is a transition from whale oil to kerosene that basically put the whale oil or the whaling industry out of business. It's interesting to note, by the way, 30 years later, kerosene basically was disrupted by this gentleman, Thomas Edison, the discovery of the incandescent light bulb, leading to the electrification as the way to generate light in society. So I bring up these examples to highlight that when we think about new sustainable technologies, it may be these types of disruptive changes that become more important than maybe the classic way of thinking about these as just kind of pure negative externalities that need to be addressed in kind of our traditional ways. And really at the heart of my arguments here is some arguments that have been made by economists such as Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the phrase, the gales of creative destruction. And so what he talks about is that this process of creative destruction, of renewal, of new technologies coming in and replacing the old, is actually an essential fact about capitalism and something that's kind of critical to our understanding of how markets and capitalism advance society and advance our technologies. So let me talk a little bit here about the book, Can Business Save the Earth? The perspective that we're trying to bring here is one very much aligned with Schumpeter. And so here's the outline of our basic argument here. First, we would observe that many of the current corporate sustainability efforts that have grown greatly over the last few decades are actually wholly insufficient to address the challenges we face as a society. In particular, when we look at climate change, which I'm going to dive deeper into in just a few seconds here, it does not seem we will get there by these kind of marginal efforts that we see today. In fact, what we need are disruptive innovations, innovations that come in and replace and transform existing industries. And obviously we need those to be of technologies that we deem sustainable and address our environmental challenges. And in fact, we need such sustainable disruptive innovation on a massive scale. We need this across many different industries, and we need it in a fairly timely fashion here. Once we put ourselves into the domain of innovation, we need to think about commercial viability. You know, distinction between invention and innovation, invention coming with something new. Innovation is really about commercialization. How does something enter the market here? So how do you create new technologies that are commercially viable and can replace the old? Once we start thinking in those terms, of course, business and markets are critical players to advancing innovation. We need to think about how they generate these new technologies and advance them. We can talk more about how entrepreneurs are often the disruptors and become an important part of this story of disruption and change. But probably most significantly is this idea that when we think about innovation itself, that emerges out of the broader socioeconomic system. What I've written with other colleagues, we've called the institutional envelope this idea that everything from public policy to private actions work in concert with one another in driving our innovation system forward. And so we advance the following conceptual framework in the book, where you have kind of a standard innovation process at the heart here. You have innovators developing new technologies. They are developed, they're commercialized, they diffuse. We have customers who are demanding these technologies, kind of pulling it through the system. We have other stakeholders like investors and managers managing this process. But equally important are these stakeholders that kind of surround this innovation process. And we call them private intermediaries, everything from universities to activists to trade associations, to, of course, public entities such as regulators, federal governments, different municipalities, national labs, and the like. All can influence how the innovation process takes place, in what direction it might go, and how quickly it might go and lead to some of these transitions. And at the real heart of what we're talking about here is the economics of industry evolution. So I'm a big fan of thinking about S-curves, this idea that if we look at most technologies, they progress over these S-curves where at first they might not improve very much, but if they are going to be widely adopted, we see this exponential improvement in the efficiency or the performance of the technology. And then eventually it might find decreasing returns to that activity. Similarly, we'll see cumulative revenues, diffusion of that technology. And then we begin to see some really interesting things like shakeouts, this idea that often in the early stages of a new technology, we'll get a massive entry by both entrepreneurial firms, diversifying incumbents, and those coming in from adjacent industries. But often there's a shakeout where firms will go away and we'll have a smaller set of firms who become dominant players in the industry. And we'll talk more about this as I go through some of the notes here. So let's turn to the task at hand here and talk a little bit about climate change. We see here a glacier, I believe this is in Greenland, that is melting into the ocean. Climate change is arguably one of the biggest threats we face as a society. We have threats from sea level rise. We have threats from increasing and disruptive weather, such as heat waves, forest fires, hurricanes, and the like. I think when I think about climate change, what worries me the most is the impacts on our social, political, and economic systems, the potential for people being displaced, having mass migration of people who are kind of environmental refugees, to stabilizing different countries and different economies. And as many of you are aware, time is running out for us to seriously address the climate change challenge we face. I'm not a climate scientist, but just to kind of quickly go through kind of the setting of what we're facing here. Here you see atmospheric CO2 concentrations over a long period of time. And as many of you are probably aware, we've seen massive increases in those concentrations since basically the rise of the industrial age here. And at the end of the day, what we're in essence facing here is a climate budget. At a certain point, as we increase this concentration of greenhouse gases, we will exceed the Paris Accord goals of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, if we continue on our current trajectory with no climate policies and the like, we're probably looking at north of 4 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature change. And while to some that might not seem like a huge number, the implications of that are actually quite profound. Even with current policies and the pledges within the Paris Accord, we're still looking at a 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius rise. So to actually achieve the goals of the Paris Accord, what we're looking at is a significant reduction of global greenhouse gases, and they point not too far in the future where we will basically have to have net zero emissions coming out of our global economy. And here's just another way of looking at this. So this is a potential path for us to achieve the Paris Accord goals. And what it suggests is that we will need to decarbonize the global economy by about 2050. And even this might be wildly optimistic because, as you see, this is assuming that we begin reducing emissions this year and continue to do so to the 2050 year period. I guess the good news, if there is good news with the global pandemic, is that we actually might see reduction in emissions globally this year because of the reduction in economic activity. But what will happen next year and what will happen as the economy, the global economy responds? Will we see those emissions go up? And there's good reason to believe that we will, which will then just shorten the time period we have for addressing these issues. So my co-author Becky Duff and I are writing a new book with Stanford University Press, taking on this question of what is the likelihood of us achieving decarbonization by 2050, and to begin to think about what are some of the levers that may be pulled to reduce, or excuse me, to increase the likelihood of decarbonization, reduce the net emission of greenhouse gases. So to set the stage here, I begin with this graph here, which talks about global greenhouse gas emissions by sector. I think when most people think about this issue, they think of energy, they think of the electrical generation sector. Perhaps surprising to some is that's actually only about a quarter of our global greenhouse gas emissions. The other one people think a lot about is transportation, automobiles and the like. That itself is only about 14% of greenhouse gas emissions. There's a couple other big sectors here. Industrials, the production of steel, cement and the like, actually are significant emitters of greenhouse gases. And I'm going to take some time to talk about agriculture, which is a particularly difficult sector, which is about a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. So just to kind of think about what that means that if we're going to decarbonize the global economy by 2050, we're talking again about massive change in the underlying technologies that we are facing in a whole set of very large and significant industries here. Again, we're not talking about, you know, a slight reduction in the emissions from automobiles. We're talking probably 100% adoption of electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. For electrical generation, we're talking about net zero emissions from renewables, nuclear, hydro. When we talk about agriculture, we're talking about the fusion of a whole set of best practices to try to reduce that carbon footprint and so on here. So this is a big undertaking, and it's going to require this sustainable, disruptive technologies that I started with at the beginning of my, my talk here. So what I'd like to do for the next 10 minutes here, 15 minutes, is just run through some of these sectors and basically give you a scorecard of thinking, where are we right now in the potential for disruption, and what are some of the levers we might pull to try to accelerate the disruptions in these sectors. So again, let's start with energy, in particular electrical generation. This is, again, one that many of us think about when we think about our climate challenge. So on the positive side here, first observations, renewables are improving. You see a nice graph here from Bloomberg that talks about the size of windmills are increasing, the output is increasing, the efficiency of these windmills are increasing. I can show you a similar graph in terms of solar panels. In fact, that S-curves that I was talking about, it really seems like we are entering the steep part of the S-curves, especially on solar here, and have some, you know, favorable trajectories here in terms of the underlying effect. As a result, and equally importantly, we are seeing prices fall in renewables. So here you see the reduction in prices for residential solar panels. We'd see a similar, if not a more dramatic one in terms of utility scale solar panels. These trends continue here. And there's every reason to believe that we are quickly approaching a time and place where renewables are actually the low cost production of energy, especially at utility scale electrical grids. In fact, in many applications around the world, that has already been achieved. And again, as prices come down, we would expect that to continue to be achieved. Here's another way of looking at this. These are power purchase agreements between electric utilities based on either natural fuel or wind farms. And if you look, just focus on the kind of the solid blue line and the solid red line, those are some forecasts for what the price would be for a wind installation versus reasonable expectations on the prices of natural gas moving forward. And what you can clearly see here is that wind is the low cost alternative compared to natural gas, at least in this one model and estimation here. So not surprising, as prices have come down, we've seen adoption increase greatly. You see on the left here, solar installations in the US. I apologize, my data is very US centric here. Just being in the United States, it's easier for us to get some of this data. You also see wind power capacity growth in the US. I'll say these same trends we see globally as well and across different regions of the world here. So we're seeing this kind of exponential growth as we would expect in the technology itself. And interestingly, here what we are looking at is the percentage of new additions to the electrical grid. And what you'll see in the US, for example, over the last 5 years, solar and wind have been over 50% of the new additions to the electrical grid there. The other big one is natural gas. Coal has basically gone away as a new source of energy because of the cost dynamics, at least in the United States. But again, we're seeing these dynamics across the world as well here, where increasingly the renewables are the low-cost alternative. One of the things we often see in these early stages of technology is what we would call a standards battle, where we might not be agreeing on exactly the right form of the technology. I put this in quotes here because it's not exactly probably the right way to think about wind and solar, but it is interesting to note that we're seeing more solar relative to wind in recent years. And I think that will continue, primarily because I think there's reasons to believe that solar is on a steeper cost curve trajectory than wind is. In many ways, wind's been around for thousands of years, so each marginal improvement is harder to achieve than it is in the case of solar, which in some ways has some features that make it look like microelectronics and microprocessors. And if you know of Moore's law, there are some reasons to believe that we could continue to see a fairly substantial decrease in the price of solar. All right, so where does that leave us today? Obviously, the big question is, will the cost of renewables continue to come down? There are issues like the scarcity of raw materials, increases the barriers to trade. The US has been increasing tariffs on China, for example, when it comes to solar panels. Just siting these locations takes time to build out our capacity of renewables. But the biggest issue, I think, is this issue of intermittency. The sun does not always shine, the wind does not always blow. And so as you get to a larger penetration of renewables on an electrical grid, you're going to have to deal with this intermittency issue. So critical to this is going to be the evolution of battery technology and other energy storage technologies. And the good news is, I'm going to talk more about this with vehicles, we are seeing a decrease in those prices and the like for batteries, but they're going to be critical here. The other thing that I'm really fascinated by, I do a lot of work on kind of digital transformation, is the opportunities leveraging the Internet of Things, cloud computing and the like, to create smart grid technology to optimize a grid in which we have literally millions of point sources of generation. So in a historical electrical grid, we have these large capacity production facilities like a natural gas generating turbine. The promise of renewables is that we could have distributed energy, solar panels on residential and commercial buildings, and that would lead to a much more pronounced diffusion of generation being connected on a grid. There's some technological challenges, there's some economic challenges with this, but there's an opportunity here to deal with some of their intermittency issues from a very robust smart grid. So I have a bunch of levers here on the right. I'm not going to go through them all. Two that come to mind here. One, again, smart grid infrastructure, really important to be investing to allow for this future of distributed energy. And then at least one we're seeing in the United States, easing of siting restrictions. Wind has historically been one of those technologies that people don't necessarily like in their backyard. Surprisingly, even solar can sometimes be hard to find the available land for siting. So I think that's going to continue to be some challenges we're going to need to work through. But overall, I'm relatively optimistic that we're starting to see this transition, but timing is everything. And so I think there's a role for policy to play to help really cause this transition in the energy sector. All right, so how will this likely play out? Just quickly here, if we continue to see decreasing costs in solars and batteries, as I've said, renewables could very well soon be the low-cost option in a lot of different applications. We'll likely see a shakeout. That's often, again, what we see, meaning that various manufacturers and installers of renewables will go out of business. We shouldn't be surprised by that. Again, that's often what happens as industries mature. I would point out fossil fuel suppliers could find themselves in a tough spot here. If we're going to see declining demand and a global glut of oil and natural gas, one would expect, as a strategist, that suppliers might resort to what I would call non-market strategies, lobbying government, trying to restrict and trying to prevent this transition from occurring. It is interesting to note that a number of tech companies have been actually helping drive this, the companies with their cloud services, Amazon, Google, but also innovating behind the grid. And again, Tesla and Google are doing some very interesting things to try to drive this type of distributed energy future that I've discussed here. And as a result, utilities might find themselves less as vertically integrated producers and more like an Uber residing in a two-sided market maker here, connecting consumers and buyers. All right, let me run through. And so here's a vision from 3M, by the way, on what a smart grid could look like, and you get the idea. Okay, so let's talk quickly here about transportation. I will say transportation and the electrification of vehicles is the one I'm probably most optimistic on at this point. You can see here technology is improving. Again, battery packs are coming down. Tesla's efforts with their gigafactories are actually helping dramatically reduce the cost of lithium-ion battery packs. And it's not unreasonable to think in the next couple of years we could reach, in essence, cost parity with gasoline here. An electric vehicle at the end of the day is actually a simple machine. It does not have all the systems you typically have in an internal combustion engine. And as a result, the real cost of them is the battery pack. So once you start to reduce that, you will find them to become very much cost competitive with traditional automobiles. Not surprisingly, as the costs have come down, sales have increased. This doesn't include, 2020, where Tesla and a number of the Chinese manufacturers have seen massive increases, even despite the recession that we're in globally on electric vehicles. So that's, again, consistent with what we would expect if there's a transition taking place. Also consistent with what we would expect is we're seeing competition growing. We're seeing basically every incumbent auto manufacturer now rushing to get electric vehicles on the market. We're seeing entrepreneurial entry, once again, Tesla in the US, but a number of companies in China like BYD, others globally as well. Again, I would not be surprised if we don't see a shakeout in this industry within the next 5 or so years, perhaps accelerated by the current economic crisis. Again, that should all be expected given the way technology shifts typically occur. And there is an interesting standards battle in electrification of vehicles. When most of us think about that, we probably think of battery-powered electric, which you see on the left here. There's good reasons to believe that it is far enough ahead that it will become the dominant technology for electrification. But there is still interesting work taking place on hydrogen fuel cells and those pushing a hydrogen alternative future. And Toyota being one, for example. So we're going to see if hydrogen fuel cells can get to the market and start to compete with batteries here. If I was a betting man, I would probably say electric batteries seem to be far enough ahead, but it still hasn't been resolved yet. So in terms of challenges here, the big challenge is going to be able to continue this downward cost curve for battery technology. There are worries about growth of supply and scarcity of raw materials. I'm optimistic that markets will adjust given the increases in demand, that we'll obviously, be able to build out the capacity for harvesting these raw materials to build the batteries that we need. There's a lot of anxiety about charging infrastructure. Once again, I'm actually very sanguine about this. I think actually it's somewhat a more perceptual challenge. I say that partly because I own a Tesla and I find that the range anxiety is almost non-existent because of the ability to charge quickly when need to on long trips and not to charge on a daily basis because I can charge at home. And so when I think about the levers here, we can continue to improve on batteries. And you put out here a battery research moonshot. Maybe there's an alternative to lithium ion that's out there that will even significantly more reduce the cost of batteries and the efficiency of the batteries here. I think actually even more interesting from a policy standpoint, are there ways to actually start earlier retirement of internal combustion engines? Because one of the things that we have to recognize is the turnover of our automotive and our transportation stock takes time. And are there ways to kind of accelerate that? By the way, I focused a lot here on autos. There are additional challenges for airlines and for global shipping and the like I'd be less optimistic are just going to take place on their own, and it'll need some additional interventions. So how will this likely play out? Again, I see battery prices and EVs as a result coming down. I think we'll see further entry here by new ventures and diversifying incumbents, and likely a global shakeout here. And there's a reason to believe that I think we'll see a large number of established automakers potentially fail. History is shown us over and over again when we have such disruptions, incumbent firms often struggle to make the transition. I think this is a technologically sufficient one that we might see some of the big global automakers go away. All right, industrials. Now things are gonna get a little tougher here. Industrials include everything from assembly of your iPhone to a manufacturer of a car. But really in industrials, there's 4 big sectors I want you to think about. Iron and steel, cement, lime, and petrochemicals. These make up greater than 70% of all industrial emissions, and each one presents challenges. So let's take steel. Steel is one where we actually have an alternative technology called the electric arc furnace that, if it was powered by renewables, could effectively decarbonize the intensity of steel production. In the US, electric arc furnaces have now become the dominant technology, and as a result, the carbon intensity of iron and steel has been reducing in the US. However, the story is really about China. And if you see here, China is the vast largest creator of steel, and they more or less use the basic oxygen furnace process, which again is very carbon intensive. So if we're going to make a transition here, there needs to be a conversation of how we convert these existing assets to low carbon or no carbon alternatives like the electric arc furnace. And then if we talk about the other sectors, I'll just simply say these are challenging. Cement, in the very process of making cement, creates greenhouse gas emissions, the chemical processes. There are green alternatives being developed, but none of them are really ready for prime time right now. The Portland cement, which has been the dominant technology for the last 80+ years, still is the dominant technology. So there needs to be further innovation, and then there'll need to be diffusion, but we're a long way from decarbonizing that sector. And then petrochemicals, as you can imagine, really highly tied to the oil and gas industry. What we really might need to do at the end of the day is substitute away from plastics to other biodegradable or bio-engineered products, and that's going to take a long time as well. That's going to take a long time. So as I said again, in the industrial sector, I think we have to go kind of subsector by subsector here. I think in some cases, the kind of broader goal is to drive electrification, especially in manufacturing processes and the like. But this is a sector where I think we might ultimately need to price CO2 emissions to get the types of change we need. In particular, one of the solutions that's out there is carbon capture and storage. But carbon capture and storage is an additional cost for any company. And so they're only motivated to do so when there is some pricing of that activity. And this is where like pricing CO2 emissions or carbon tax or cap and trade system could come into play here. But I think you're going to have to see some government intervention to make the progress we need in some of these sectors. All right, last but not least, I was going to talk about agriculture. This is the big one to me. This is one of the most challenging sectors for us to address. One of the reasons is, unlike these other sectors, one would expect there to be increasing demand for food just simply by population growth. So here you see declining population growth, which is wonderful in many ways for our environmental challenges, but that still means the cumulative number of people will be increasing, and projections are by 2100 we'll have close to 11 billion people. All of those people need to be fed, and more often than not, as economies mature, people also demand more protein-rich diets. And as you'll see in a second here, that can be problematic depending on how they get that protein. So if we think about the emissions here, you'll see 39% of global agricultural emissions come from enteric fermentation. We joke about it, but literally, cows belching and passing gas is a significant contributor to methane emissions and global greenhouse gas emissions. Similarly, leaving manure left on the pasture is 16%. And then there's also things like the use of fertilizers, which contributes about 13%, the nitrogen being then put into the atmosphere as a result, and that's a significant greenhouse gas. So if you think about livestock itself, it really is a story about cattle and beef. You can see 60% of the global emissions are coming from both beef and dairy, others as well, but that's really the largest source here. So on the positive side, there's a lot of activity in this sector. We see efforts on methane capture. There is this effort on clean meat. Becky, my co-author, and I disagree on how ready for prime time this is. She's more optimistic than I am. GMOs, even things like using our information technology to do smart and precision farming to reduce the amount of new fertilizer and the like that we need. I think all of these are very promising. What's hard to see is how one of these would be a silver bullet, how one of these would suddenly diffuse through our global agricultural supply chain and address that 25% of emissions that we see coming from the agricultural sector. The good news is this is one of the few sectors where we can actually create negative emissions. and the idea of a carbon sink. Can we return aggregable land to forests would be a way to significantly reduce the net emissions from the agriculture sector. So if we increase efficiency and yields, reduce the land we use for farming and turn them back into forests, that could be the way we can get to zero emissions in the sector. So again, very challenging sector. One of the things I think makes it particularly challenging is thus the global diffuse nature of farming. If you look at like electrical generation in the United States, literally maybe a few thousand point sources of emissions. When we look at the agriculture industry, we're talking millions and millions of large farms, small farms, family farms, all of them having a carbon footprint. And how do you bring about change in such a large and diffuse industry? I'm going to highlight just two levers here quickly. Again, this might be one where we need to think about pricing greenhouse gas emissions. I put here in kind of colloquially, a cow tax to kind of limit the consumption of beef. I don't know, in the region of the world you may come from, I can tell you in the US, this would be politically very difficult to get passed in the United States. And so that leads to a second suggestion, which is we really need to think about subsidizing forest growth and ways in which we can grow more carbon sinks to offset our agricultural needs and footprint. So let me just end with some final thoughts here. Again, taking climate change seriously, and in particular the Paris Accord goals, will require a concerted effort to bring about disruptive change. Again, this is not about marginal changes in your carbon footprint here. We are talking wholesale technology changes across a number of very large and important sectors to our global economy. I think to make progress is going to require both a mix of public and private interventions to both accelerate the diffusion and the innovation of these technologies. So policy leaders need to be thinking broadly about the levers in their toolkit. And one of the themes of my 2018 book on Can Business Save the Earth is, things like putting a price on carbon. I am very supportive of that. But there's things like subsidizing R&D, investing in national laboratories and university research. All of these need to be considered for us to kind of make the amount of progress really needed to address this issue. And for businesses, I encourage businesses to think about looking for opportunities to reform markets and drive new technologies. It's not, again, just about reducing your carbon footprint. Now, for some, that might be trying to drive change up your supply chain. Maybe it's getting your various suppliers, if they are like steel or cement, to try to think about innovating. Or if it's agriculture, if you're a restaurant or a food service company downstream. But again, it's got to be very significant changes here. It's not just merely reducing emissions by 10%. We're talking about substantial change. But to end on a positive note, I just wanted to share this from the Atlantic. This is S-curves for consumption. This is US households for various technologies. And so you can see things like the telephone and electricity took literally 40, 50 years before it reached over 90% penetration. You look more recently, and especially if we put something like smartphones, like the iPhone, penetration was less than 10 years. So for whatever reason, it seems like technologies are diffusing faster today than they have in the past. And that's a good news for us because we need this to happen, and we need to happen quickly. I think the speed is critical. It's why some people are talking about we really have about 10 years here to make significant progress if we're really going to, address the Paris Accord goals. I think it's going to be difficult. I'm an optimist by nature, but just looking at the data, it is hard to see how we get there. What I would advocate for is a sector-based approach where we really work through each of these sectors like I have and think about policies and interventions and technology collaborations with businesses in each individual sector to try to get us there. And I'll just end by saying this is part of something called the Business Innovation and Climate Change Initiative. So you see the website there. We have a whole bunch of reports and of course the book and the like if you're interested in learning more. So I apologize, I went about 5 minutes longer than I wanted to, but we do still have 20 minutes here for Q&A. And so Sarah, do you want to take it away?
Okay, so thank you so much for so much content. There's a lot of food for thought. So let me get to Roland Bardi. Now, Roland Bardi, he was working in the chemical industry for 30 years. in a particular company, and they they've invented lots of processes to save energy and reduce waste. And he's picking your brains. Now, what he's asking, and feel free to switch your camera on, Roland. And basically he's asking that a lot of the climate change and atmospheric concentration, a lot of the forecasting doesn't really account for the technological process that would involve innovations for the future. So yeah. What I understand is he is saying that a lot of the forecasting doesn't take into account the pace of the progress that you were talking about, or I would add the diffusion of technology. And he just wants to ask your take on this. Where do they meet?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'm amazed by the number of times I read, linear estimates of future diffusion of technology. So you'll look at it and it'll say, all right, X number of electric vehicles were sold this year, and we draw a straight line in the future, and we say by 2070, electric vehicles should make up half of our, vehicles on the road. Imagine doing that in 2008 and saying, the iPhone sold X number, and if I look at a straight line graph by 2030, maybe iPhones will become 10% of the marketplace, right? Clearly not accurate. And the reason it's not accurate is these S-curves again. More often than not, technology tends to go on these exponential growth curves, and those can happen very quickly. So take electric vehicles. I'm relatively optimistic that in the next decade, we will see them become the dominant technology in automotives. How that affects the dynamics here, I'm going to go back actually all the way to the beginning here, if you don't mind. Let me see if I can get back here. And I think what you'll see, sorry here. If I go back all the way to my graph here about the path to 2050, what gives me a lot of pause and gives me a lot of worry, oh, there we go. Sorry, a little bit of lag here on my, my data. Okay, what gives me worry here is even with a relatively optimistic projection of the transitions here, this graph is still going to be hard to achieve. And let's look at the next 4 or 5 years, right? If we see, as we hope to see, economic growth coming out of the current recession, we will then, if we take everything equal, we'll see net emissions likely go up rather than down. And every year they go up, that 2050 date gets closer and closer. In fact, if we don't make significant progress by 2030, I mean, we could be looking at 2035 needing to get to net emissions there. So it's this really a race between technology shifts, but we're still admitting, and the economy is still growing, which we want, of course. And so there is this risk that we see net emissions go up even as we're making these technology transitions take place. So there's a roundabout way of saying, Roland, like I think you're right that a lot of the projections don't factor in technology shifts. But when I look at this graph, this is baking in massive technology shifts very quickly to get us to 2050.
Right, and this is a question that I'm actually interested on. So Juliana, who is on the call as well, we are both asking you this question because we're so concerned about buildings and the built environment. And that's one of these sectors where, very interestingly, there's a whole value chain in this. So how buildings are made, how the materials that go in them, how they are designed, how the architecture and the industry puts it all together, does the pricing for them. And then this is an incredibly large market that I think in the future populations will grow by 2030 with increased heat. The need for cooling will triple by 2050. So once again, we have another greenhouse gas emissions problems. This is one of these massive sectors. And how would you approach something that is so broad with various stakeholders and rules and regulations as the construction sector, with all of the stakeholders involved? I mean, how do you where do you begin?
Yeah, so in our new book, we actually do have a chapter on buildings. I didn't cover it today just because for time constraints here. Well, first, the way we thought about it is in all of our work, we're thinking about scope 1 emissions. So emissions in situ from the entity here. So when it comes to buildings, a significant amount of their emissions is from electricity, but electricity generated by utilities and other parties. So one solution for the built environment is simply if we can, drive net emissions to zero in our electrical generation, that significantly reduces your building footprint. Here at Darden, actually, we're very proud. We're net zero greenhouse gas emissions. But again, the vast majority, like 97% of our emissions, came from electrical generation from our provider, Dominion Power, who we worked with to build a solar field to support our electrical needs. So that's one part of the equation. Where you see the kind of scope 1 emissions from buildings, first off, is typically the use of natural gas or propane and other things for heating and also for cooking. That varies quite a bit around the world. The good news is there are technological solutions for electrifying these. You can have electrical air conditioning and heat generation and even cooking. But you have a built infrastructure, as you were kind of highlighting before, that you need to change. In the US, our building codes are very localized. There is no national building code. So you almost have to be working locality to locality to try to change building codes and get investments to cause this transition. The good news is from an innovation technology standpoint, these alternatives typically aren't that much more expensive, if expensive at all, compared to some of these. Some of this is just about kind of established infrastructure and then replacing it with the new. The third thing I would highlight that you also mentioned is building materials. So this kind of goes in our model right to the industrial sector again, cement and the like. So if you could green cement and create a green cement, then it solves the problem in one way. But the other thing that you can do, of course, is reduce demand. And I think in some of these industrial sectors, that's exactly what needs to take place. There's some interesting work being done on like structural timber as a substitute for steel and cement for building buildings. I think the largest we've got now is like a 7-story building that's built with structural timber. That's a long way to go compared to some of the massive business towers and the like we see in cities throughout the world, which really require steel and cement. But I do think is a sector, as you said, that is looks like the agriculture sector and how diffuse it is and how difficult it is to bring about change on a global basis.
Okay, and just another question is actually, trying to pick your brain with by bringing the discussion closer to the Egypt model, since we're here, or so where do emerging markets and countries with this sort of demographic emerging markets, current GDPs, many shocks coming into the system, and how do you function with technology within this kind of ecosystem that is still finding its footing? Yeah. So I'd love to hear about that and really sort of focus on Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, to put an optimistic spin, one of the opportunities is as economies are growing and as they're developing further, they don't have to replicate the same paths taken by Western Europe or the US, for example. So there's an opportunity for kind of leapfrogging. Where we've seen that probably most pronounced is in telecommunications in parts of Africa, where basically leapt over land-based communications and went with cellular. Could we see a similar type of build out as these economies are growing around renewables versus needing to build out others? I think so. Building out, of transportation and the movement towards vehicles in places like India. I apologize, I don't know the Egyptian context that well, but you can imagine again transitioning towards electrification, maybe even quicker than countries with established infrastructures already in place to support internal combustion engines. So that's the positive spin. On the kind of challenges side, I think we just have to take it as an article of faith here that these economies want to grow. They want to create economic development. They want to create greater welfare for their citizens. And so understanding the growth imperatives in those economies is really critical for how we imagine this moving forward. We just can't assume like it's about reducing consumption. And that's a common theme of what I'm trying to suggest here. You know, arguments that we need to do less and less, and that's the way we're going to achieve our sustainability, I just don't think are realistic. It's going to have to be these technology shifts. I think you have opportunities for even partnerships between countries and companies that can help bring about these changes, help accelerate, again, these transitions. And I think there's actually market opportunities too. As we see these transitions, as I mentioned, the large incumbent companies often struggle with these. So this is an opportunity for countries like Egypt and others to actually become leaders in these emergent technologies. In many ways, they level the playing field, and there's opportunities for others to come in and potentially, you know, become global players.
And Dr. Ali, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. When we talk about disruptive technology in general, we tend to focus on technological aspects. Most of the time, what takes you a long time to get the diffusion of the technology are things related to ecosystem, things related to process innovation. I'll give you a simple example, automotive. I mean, the car has been around since the late 1970s, 1700, since the late 1700s. And there were cars in the 1800s. The problem were twofold. The first is how to produce it mass scale in a cheaper way. And this came in the early 1900s, the Henry Ford model. The other one is the road network. I mean, the road network in Europe and the US hasn't been widespread except in the late 1930s or early 40s. And that's what takes a longer time, because it takes you a very long time to get an ecosystem to accept. Like in your case, in the Tesla, for example, you need a charging network, right? That might not be available right now, and it takes a while until you get it. And it takes a government intervention, and it takes an awareness from the people, etc. So I just wanted to hear your comment about this.
Yeah, and I think you know, I totally agree. I mean, I think in many ways that's kind of one of the core messages we're trying to communicate in both of these books. When I look at the political debates around climate change again, and that's why I started with my story about whaling, there is so much energy put into, again, putting a price on carbon. And again, as an economist, I support this, and I think it would be a huge lever to pull to try to advance ourselves. But why not also simultaneously pursue opportunities that I think are less politically fraught, at least here in the United States? For example, infrastructure development for electric utilities. Like, let's make a massive play for smart grid technology that can support a distributed network of electricity that can deal with some of the intermittency issues that renewables present. And I think if you solve that problem, you're going to start to see the private market then take over on things like distributed solar installations on homes and commercial businesses. So I think the infrastructure piece, I completely agree. It's going to be critical really in all of these sectors, and it's a great place where government can come in and help accelerate the diffusion and adoption of these technologies. And again, I believe maybe less fraught. You know, in the recent COVID crisis, the U.S., like many countries, has put out, you know, massive subsidies to different industries to try to keep them, you know, going and propped up. For various political reasons, you know, we put massive subsidies to oil and gas. Our fracking industry is in shambles. It doesn't work at $20, you know, a barrel. But is that smart? Is that a smart idea to prop up industries that maybe are being transformed as we speak? Would it have been better to invest that money again in some of these infrastructure projects that can ultimately create more jobs and create more economic growth, let alone help with the environmental aspects here? And so I think, you know, a big advocate for industrial technology policy, you know, thinking through where are we trying to go, and how do we then, you know, provide the mechanisms for doing so. The challenge, of course, with this, and it's one that I don't have a good answer to other than it's a balancing act, is I'm a big believer that like, it's very hard for governments to pick technologies correctly. So what you really want to do is you want to help put guardrails on innovation where you're saying we want innovation to move towards the sustainable technology front, but we don't want to constrain it so much that we kill the innovation process. So going back to your point, infrastructure to me is a great one where you're not picking, you know, solar or wind or nuclear or any of these. You're just creating the conditions under which those technologies can thrive. And then the marketplace will then, and the technology will then determine how it ultimately shakes out there. But it is a balancing act between, again, encouraging the direction of innovation towards sustainable ends without constraining it so much that you kind of, in essence, kill the innovation process.
Mike, I really thank you for a very informative webinar. I mean, for me, it was an eye-opener in many aspects. I thank you, Sarah, also for very good moderation. It's been a pleasure. Next week, we will have Professor Henry Mensberg of McGill University. We'll have a discussion about rebalancing society, the role of schools of business, and management of the pandemic and health system. And we will start at 8 p.m., not the usual 7 p.m. So stay tuned and see you soon. And again, I thank Mike Lenox and I thank Sarah Al-Battuti for a fantastic webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all.